Good. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to this wonderful event commemorating the 55th anniversary of the Women's Studies in Religion program at Graduate Theological Union. I'm so delighted today to be accompanied by five wonderful colleagues who have served in various ways with the Women's Studies in Religion program at various points in time. My name is Sheryl Johnson, use she, her pronouns, and had the great privilege of serving as the Women's Studies in Religion coordinator from 2016 till 2021. And then after graduating and now teaching at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, I've rejoined our steering committee and I'm so delighted to be reconnecting with this work. First, I'd like to call on, let's see here, Dr. Pamela, would you be willing to share a bit about yourself, your time at GTU, and then now what you're doing presently?
Sure. I was director of what was then the Center for Women and Religion, CWR, from 1989 to 1994. And we can talk about it further, but that was a period where we were deeply discerning our relationship to the GTU and what its future should be. A lot of internal discussions about that, some conflicts, different feminisms at work philosophically. Currently, I have recently retired as the Christiane Brooks Johnson Professor of Psychology and Religion at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And I've been at a few other institutions along the way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Dr. Cheryl, would you share?
Greetings, everyone. Yes, Cheryl Kirk-Duggan. I was at CWR from January of 1997 through December of 2003. At that point, the schools were still supporting us, and I had a chance to meet many of the phenomenal women that are on our panel today. And how I got there was because I'd spoken at an interfaith service where the other folks were male, and I got a call from Lori Pister, would you please speak? Lori had been a student when Glenn Booker was dean at Columbia Theological Seminary, and then Glenn was then president of the GTU, and they had been searching for a leader for 2 years. And because of that, we interviewed, I said yes, and I came on board that January because I needed to get closure, because at that point I was teaching at Meredith College, and they decided not to keep me on tenure track because I spoke for justice, and I was wondering, what am I going to do? And I got the call, and then the rest is history, so went to GTU.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. Dr. Nancy, what's your background with WSR?
Yes, certainly. Nancy Pineda-Madrid. I was a student at the GTU. I did my doctoral studies there, and I very much in feminist theology. I was there between 1995 and 2005, and so I was working in feminist theology, Latinx theology, and got connected up with Dr. Sheryl during my time there, which was really quite beneficial for me. Since then, in 2005, I was offered a position at Boston College, and I was at Boston College from 2005 to 2019. And then I was offered an endowed chair at Loyola Marymount University, where I am today. I have an endowed chair in Catholic theology, and I think I may be one of the very few Latinas in the United States that has such a chair at a Catholic institution. So that's been part of my journey, and I'm a full professor at LMU, of course, at this time.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing some of your story. Dr. Mary, would love to hear from you as well.
Thank you. It's great to be with all of you, and it's great to celebrate this milestone for women's studies at the GTU. I'm Mary Hunt. I arrived at the GTU in September of 1974. With the ink still wet on my master's from Harvard Divinity School, I came to do a doctorate in philosophical and systematic theology, added an MDiv at the Jesuit school while writing my dissertation. In the first week that I was there in 1974, I asked Sally Dries, then the director of what was called the Office of Women's Affairs. Now, I caution you that the name was later changed to protect the guilty. But what was then it became the Center for Women in Religion. But I asked Sally what was happening with women and where I could swim. Those were my two priorities. I finished the MDiv in 1979 at the Jesuit school, And the answer, by the way, to the question was the Hearst Pool. That was a pool for women in Berkeley. I finished a PhD in 1980 and left for Latin America, where I spent a couple of years. I have been a staunch supporter of the GTU since then, and I continue to champion its virtues and still what I consider its largely unrealized potential. I think there's much more potential. And I think if women are taken seriously, that potential will be actualized much more quickly. Now, 40 years later, so it's a long time. I would be in the dinosaur section, I think, of the gathering for this group. I'm the co-founder and co-director of a group called WATER, the Women's Alliance for Theology, Ethics, and Ritual in Silver Spring, Maryland. We work in feminist studies and religion. We write, organize, lecture, and network. Everything I learned to do at the GTU, at the Office of Women's Affairs, the Center for Women in Religion, and I predated the actual academic study of religion program. I can say that that really was a forming experience and very formative experience for me, and it helped me to create new spaces for other people to do some of the same things. And I still swim a lot.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks for that little tidbit of Berkeley recommendation.
Yeah, the Hearst
And
Pool outside.
wonderful. California, right? And last but certainly not least, Dr. Boyung, would you introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Boyung Lee. I joined the faculty of PSR in 2002. And during that time, the GTU's Faculty of Color group was meeting, and the Center for Women and Religion was really, really struggling because the GTU was not supporting the center financially. And Cheryl had to raise fund for her own salary and program. It was a really difficult time. So I think that group was really surrounding Cheryl to get through that period. And that group is the one who suggested Cheryl, whatever funding remained, that she should be paid so that she could eat. And then we gracefully closed the center and then reimagined. So I was part of that process. And then after that, Dr. Rosemary Luther, who was also on the faculty at GTU and PSR, formed a small group to process that experience and to reflect on. So she organized a conference, and I was part of a steering working team with her and her TA, three of us. We put together a conference to celebrate the center, to reimagine, and I think I presided the first panel that had Mary and Nancy together.
Yeah.
And then after that, I and several other women faculty at the GTU that includes Andrea Biller, who is now in Basel, Joyce Mercer, who is academic dean at Yale, and Naomi Seidemann, who left for University of Toronto, and Marion Grau, who is in Norway teaching theology. And then myself, we formed a task force to start women's studies in religion. And it was a very challenging and funny and interesting bonding experience because we come from such different understanding of women's and religion. And then I left GTU in 2017 to be the dean at ILEF School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. And so I'm still here, but I served the dean for 6 years, and now I'm teaching full-time as a full professor here.
Wonderful. Thanks so much to each of you. It's good to have an opportunity to situate your stories and your connections a little bit, as well as to know what you're presently doing. Now we've kind of got through some of the details, I'd love for each of you to reflect a little bit more on how Women's Studies in Religion, or the Center for Women in Religion, shaped your experience at GTU. I know for myself, the experience of having interactions with faculty in a bit more of a casual environment, the opportunity for putting on both lectures as well as mentoring and arts-based, ritual-based, all sorts of different programming really added so much to my experience at GTU. So I'd love to invite each of you now, and I'll go in the same order, to just share a little bit about how Women's Studies in Religion impacted your time at Graduate Theological Union. So I'd like to invite Dr. Pamela to share.
Sure. Well, one thing that was very important that for me, for my own scholarship and advocacy and activism, was that I had already been involved with what was then known as the battered women's movement. and brought that with me to the work. And so we did quite a bit with, at that time, we had a journal, a newsletter, so we had publications, we had programs, which were not for credit, and then we also did courses through, we were accredited through some of the different seminaries. And so I did regularly teach a course on violence against women during that time, and also we were just beginning to understand the impact of clergy sexual abuse of adult women, and formed some support groups for women who had gone through that experience, and began working with some people in denominations around formulating the first policies and procedures, which did not exist. So for me, that was a springboard for more scholarly hyphen activist writing, and it was the CWR board and also the women faculty who I convened, who encouraged me to write my first pastoral theology book, which was The Cry of Tamar, Violence Against Women and the Church's Response. So that was a very important personal and professional impact on me. I think the other thing that I really learned, I mean, I knew that feminism wasn't one thing. And in the chapter I wrote in Rosemary's anthology about the GTU, Feminist Theology's Legacy and Prospect, which came out in 2007, I think it was a result of that conference, actually, that many of us were at. I knew there were radical Marxist feminists. I knew there were liberal feminists who the radical Marxists considered to be now bourgeois feminists. There were essentialist feminists who wanted equality for women, but insisted on women being completely different and very biologically developed. We didn't have much multicultural feminism at that time. There weren't a lot of women of color represented anywhere in the GTU, except there were certainly African American students and faculty at what was then the Baptist ABSW. But we were a pretty white institution throughout the GTU. We were reading about it. We wanted to do more with it. And then only a couple of faculty members actually were engaging with what was then European postmodern feminism. So I knew intellectually that there were all these different feminisms before I got there. But we were living it, because the decision whether to be independent as a 501c3 nonprofit or to go in with the GTU as a program unit and turned over our endowment and our funding to them to administer. And I still say them because there was very much an us-them understanding. A lot of issues around authority and could it be trusted. The radical Marxist feminists said, absolutely not. We do not want a hierarchical relationship with anybody. We have been a collective since we were the Office of Women's Affairs, and we want to retain that kind of leadership and that kind of organization. The liberal feminists, who I would say the majority of people going for ordination and in mainline Protestant churches, were trying to change the church from within. And so because they wanted to see more women ordained, they wanted to see more women faculty employed, that was more about equality with men in institutions, but not disparaging the idea of institutions with some hierarchical leadership. We had an essentialist feminist scholar in residence, but they didn't really have a lot of influence. We had members who were very much into women's spirituality and goddess spirituality, but that didn't really affect the organizational change. So those were kind of the predominant philosophical views at that time. And what finally won out, and it was partly generational, I think, that the board and some of the faculty were of a slightly older generation, and many of them had grown up in consciousness-raising radical feminism, but they saw the practical reality of wanting to join the GTU in the hope, because funding was dwindling from the seminaries or holding steady when prices were going up for us. They saw the practicality of joining, but also they saw that relationality was an important feminist value. And to stay in relation with the GTU community became an important way of understanding why we didn't want to split off and become a separate entity. So that was the decision that was made finally by the board. And I think it did preserve some support from the seminaries for a while. But even in the years between when I left in 94 and Cheryl came on in 97, that support had just kind of become tepid. And what I had worried about then about becoming a women's studies program within the curriculum of the GTU schools is still a worry that I carry to this day, which is that if people who are not primarily invested in feminist, womanist thought are in charge ultimately, then it's not necessarily going to be treated as a priority. And there will be some people who will actively say, oh, women are doing fine now. We don't need that anymore. It's a historical relic. Whereas I see that we need it, given the times we're in, all the more. So
Amen.
I learned a lot about the ways in which our philosophical commitments can really inform our view of what an organization is like and see the perils and the benefits down the road, depending on how we understand ourselves as feminists, womanists, Black feminists, Latinx feminists, in a much more multicultural way now, too. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. That mapping is very helpful. Dr. Sheryl, please pick us up.
Absolutely. And one of the things I did not say, after I left the GTU, I ended up being a full professor at Shaw University Divinity School in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's the oldest HBCU in the South. And they actually have in the curriculum a required course in women's studies before I got there, which is rare for most, even today with many MDiv curriculum, there is no gender-based required course. And once I got there, I also was invited into doing more work, as Dr. Mary was talking about, in terms of battered women. I had a social worker to come and say, we've got clergy and we've got social workers, and they're not talking to each other, so we need your help. So I did more work in that. And part of my time, so I was at Shaw from 2004 August through 2021, when God said, I need you to stop doing this to help people help themselves with their grief and loss. So I have an LLC, and that's what my focus is on now, as well as helping people find their writing voice, which I started learning how to do that when I was at the GTU, because I had a student to come in and said, I can't finish my dissertation. I'm going, of course you can, and figured out how to help people do that. So that's the work I'm doing now. Being at CWR was an amazing journey, and Dr. Pam's statements, I really got that people thought, we have got women faculty, we've got women students, period. That's all that needs to happen. Whereas with the center, we did amazing conferences. We continued to do the journal. We had, for our conferences, we had honorary chairs like Madam Secretary Hillary Clinton, the late Della Reese, who herself was ordained and also was doing things in ministry. One of our last speakers was the late Bell Hooks. So we were doing some amazing, amazing work at the center and between the conferences, and also we continued the classes, and we had the classes in the small little house that was next to PSR, that when the LGBTQ plus committee developed at PSR, we lost that space and we continued to do the work. I became more aware because I grew up in a household where God was the head, my parents were partners. So I didn't understand the whole thing about what is this gender business until I got to seminary, when that's when I learned that women weren't the sons, their dads. When I said, are you kidding me? And so then being at CWR became even a greater awareness. And to me, which is hysterical about my life, is that if you look at all my transcripts, all the classes, my undergrad was in voice and piano, so I took all those classes. I never had a course in women's studies. All my jobs in religious studies have been around women and religion, which really helped to radicalize my preaching and teaching, because then I've gotten to do work with it going, look at this text. And that was one of the things that CWR just said, look at this text. This text in Judges 11 says, let's just sacrifice the girl. And this text in Judges 19 says, cut the woman up and send her body parts. It's like, Well, the Bible says, yeah, but the Bible also says what not to do. And so being at CWR, I met a lot of phenomenal students and faculty. And the one thing I insisted on when I came on board, I told Glenn, I said, I will not take being executive director of CWR unless I have a faculty position. Because I knew that faculty would not accord the respect to someone who was quote unquote only staff, although the centers were doing amazing work. And so because at that time, the majority of the women were in Area 4, Ethics, Religion, and Society, so I jumped into Area 3. At that time, there were no women. And at some point became co-chair. And also in the required course, Nancy will probably remember this, I added in W.E.B. Du Bois, so you have a black voice, and I added in Hannah Arendt, so you'd have a woman's voice in the required course for historical and philosophical theology. And so whereas the center does no longer exist as it was, and we're grateful for the women's studies group, we have made inroads. And the challenge is, since things are even more compressed now, and this whole MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again, is really wanting to make young white women, if you go to college, go as a finishing school, get out, marry, produce 2.5 kids, and have the cat and dog, and keep yourself closed down. That's kind of where we are. And we have several denominations, especially Southern Baptists, who just within the last 5 to 10 years said, wives, you will submit to your husbands, misinterpreting the Greek, because the Greek says be in partnership with. So we've got way more work to do, and I'm glad that we have this forum so that we can let people know things have gone on before, and that's why we need to know our history and our her stories.
Thank you for that. Yes, time unfortunately is not progressing onwards, but we are going backwards so much in this moment. So thank you for sharing that powerful word of where we need to go next. Dr. Nancy, would you share about your experience?
Sure. I'm delighted to not only be here, but to follow Dr. Sheryl, because Sheryl, my memory of the GTU is that I hung out with you in WSR's office. And as a woman of color, growing up in El Paso, Texas, being Mexican as I am, I really identified with you. And I was one of those people that thought, oh my God, how can I ever finish my dissertation? And how will this ever come to be? And you really pushed me a lot. I had a sense of recognition because of your presence and your leadership at the center, and as well as feeling like I could be out there and not be timid about my writing and my speaking, which I was inclined to be at the time that I met you and that started. So I feel that my own work and what I've become in the leadership that I exercise today in many ways is rooted in my experience and your particular contribution. It was very, very important to me. And I've gone on, I've done a lot of writing, all of which is really centered on different angles of women's experience, but in particular, my work is all on violence against women. It's interesting to me to hear just how many of us have done this work. You know, where I was, since I grew up in El Paso, Texas, the explosion of feminicide happened in Ciudad Juarez in the mid-1990s. And I picked up on that and wrote Suffering and Salvation in Ciudad Juarez, which was the first theological work to address the tragedy, the violence of feminicide, the killing of women because they are women, in a systematic way. So that looking at that and how we have to understand how our thinking of salvation has to change, taking seriously this reality. And then I wrote a second book that was dealing with many of these themes, titled Theologizing in an Insurgent Key, Violence, Women, and Salvation. And there, really exploring this as a problem, not only of course, not in Juarez. And at the time I wrote that second book, Juarez wasn't really the epicenter in Mexico anymore. It was really more Mexico City. But then looking at many other countries in Latin America in particular, because I have an interest there, that where the problem of the killing of women is very, very serious. And being Roman Catholic, I was extremely concerned by the fact that the two countries with the largest number of Catholics in the world are Brazil and Mexico, just in terms of raw numbers, not percentages. And the two countries in the world that have the greatest tragic reality of feminicide in the world, again, raw numbers, Brazil and Mexico. So not that there's a causal relationship, but and there may be, we haven't really done the analysis of that, but that's what drives me. And now at the moment, well, since then I've looked at what's the reality of feminicide in the United States. And if you look at Native American women in this country, I mean, it's horrific. I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is one of the epicenters of the killing of Native women in this country. So it's not something that just exists south of the border, but is a reality here in the United States. And that really drives me. And then looking at theological symbols like Our Lady of Guadalupe and how she's been interpreted or misinterpreted, and that matters because it helps us to critique the violence that we see, or to turn a blind eye, depending on how major symbols like this are interpreted. So anyway, those are some of the questions and realities that I've been working on. I'm very much a product of the borderlands, and have done a lot of work on thinkers like Anzaldúa, Sherry Moraga, a lot of the Chicana feminist theorists. It was great being part of the Women's Center, and then also to take advantage of UC Berkeley and all the extremely fine scholars there. So anyway, that's a little bit about my story and what I've been about.
Thank you so much. And yes, so powerful that women's lives and women's survival is a common theme for all of you so far. So thank you so much for this important work. Dr. Mary, what would you share?
Well, thank you. The first thing I want to share is that in listening to my esteemed colleagues, I realized that my own experience at the GTU as a student, never as a faculty member, but as a student, was fully 20 years before some of you, which is, Pamela, you said 1994 for you yourself at CWR, and I was there in 1974.
89 is when I started. But
yeah,
still,
but what was 89? But
94 is when I finished.
Oh,
but
okay.
Yes,
but
you were
we're
still
talking, and certainly with Cheryl, we're talking about 20 years before. And Nancy, I was in Area 3, 20 years before you as well. So I'm just trying to contextualize this so that we understand that there was a lot before, and there were people before me, certainly. But what we did, there was no program. There was neither an academic program nor the kind of more popular level programs. But we developed a relationship through some of our contacts with the Ford Foundation for funding. And we brought people like Charlotte Bunch, Carol P. Christ, Beverly Wilding Harrison to teach. And they actually taught classes. They weren't just there to be for a weekend, but they actually came and taught classes. There were very few women in those days teaching at the GTU. Eventually, Sandra Schneiders at the Jesuit School, and Wire at SFTS, and Brotherton also at the Jesuit School. And a few other schools had women, but very, very few, and mostly white women. Leslie Ziegler was at Pacific School of Religion from Bangor Theological Seminary. Karen Labax, of course, was an early professor of ethics and longtime contributor to women's work at the GTU. Dodie Donnelly was at the Jesuit School. These are names that many people won't recognize, but they were, in fact, among the pioneers. Even my own Compson dissertation were among the first academic feminist forays at the GTU. And I wrote a dissertation called Feminist Liberation Theology, the Development of Method in Construction, finished in 1980. So that's an early time to be putting those materials together. I also, my MDiv thesis was the 1978 Women's Ordination Conference lecture that I gave on Roman Catholic ordination, patriarchal past, and feminist future. So that became my MDiv thesis. So what I'm trying to get to is that the work that we did then was without precedent. We just didn't have role models. But my own success was in part because, and largely because of my privilege. And that is to say, white, upper middle class, well-educated, healthy women were able to do a lot because of our privilege. And we were clear that our privilege would not be the standard by which other people would be measured, but that our work would always be, and my work continues to this day to be, to make the Academy and Feminist Studies safe for everyone to hear the voices of a variety of people. And I've been working on that for the last 40 years. And I mean that very sincerely, that that's what I learned at the GTU. Was that, okay, it was fine that I could make my way, but it wasn't fine that there weren't other people there who had other perspectives, other sets of experiences. So Rosemary Ruther, of course, was a major influence on me and on other people. She was both on my MDiv committee for the talk on ordination and also on my PhD committee. And she was brought in, now imagine this was in 1979, 1980. She was brought in those days because the GTU men knew little or nothing about feminist studies in religion. My own beloved advisor, Joe Powers, who's a Jesuit, used to say to me, well, Mary Elizabeth, I won't get in your way and I will not ask much of you. If you don't get in my way and don't ask much of me. And so that was kind of our pact. And I love Joe. He was a great guy. He knew very little about what I was talking about, but he was smart enough to know that if he got out of the way, things were going to happen and that it would be mutually enhancing, and it was. We also had in those days the presence of Anne McGrew Bennett, whose work as a pioneer feminist theologian was very important. She and her husband, John Bennett, who was president of Union Seminary, were at PSR and GTU. They had a major impact by their presence. She was a good friend of Nell Morton, who was in Claremont, so that tied us in with people in Claremont. Anita Caspery was at the Franciscan School. She was, as you know, the legendary president and head of the Community of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in LA. That college closed and she moved up to Berkeley and taught at FST. But Anita Caspery was one of the great women of the 20th century in Catholicism. So there are three things that I learned. One was we had to do it ourselves against the odds and without role models. That was number one. Number two, I learned that we had to do foundational work. We couldn't just do what we felt like. We really had to. That's why I was in Area 3. I was in philosophical and systematic theology, heavy lifting around methodology, because that work later became the stuff of classes that people taught. Rosemary was my role model, Rosemary Ruther. She had been at Harvard, and she studied the work that she did, the foundational work she did at Harvard was what she later taught at PSR and GTU. So I watched that whole process play out. And the third thing we had to do was not only do it ourselves and do foundational work, but we also had to rely on colleagues. We had to rely on each other for everything. Our sister students, the women in the administration who were supportive, oftentimes under the table, Betty Over, the registrar, Sharon Gay Smith, registrar, Joyce Hunt, who was the finance person. These women were positive and helpful when there weren't a lot of faculty women to be there. And some of the women faculty who were there, God bless them, didn't have the bandwidth for all that we needed because they were dealing with the same problems, the sexism, the racism, the lack of promotion and tenure, the lack of taking their work seriously, all the patriarchal criteria and assumptions about what scholarship was like. They were dealing with that. So to expect them to have bandwidth to have been available to us was just unrealistic. And I observed so many things that they did so well that I only hope that I have lived up to some of their really some of their enormous role modeling, even though I didn't understand it. And then, of course, there were the people like Sheryl and like Pamela and like Mary Cross and Peggy Cleveland and Barbara Waugh, who were the people who ran the center. And they were much needed role models and enormous supporters of women students without whom we would not have gotten through that work. So we were doing it ourselves, we were doing it in foundational ways, and we were doing it with each other. And I have to say, I have brought all that with me now 50 years later, and I'm deeply grateful.
Oh, thank you so much. And thanks for lifting up some of those various names as well. I think it's so important that those names are remembered. Dr. Boyung, on to you.
Yeah, mine will be short. When I studied my PhD at Boston College as a non-Catholic in 1994, I was the first Asian or Asian American in my PhD program in that century-old institution. So as a non-Catholic and at school, everyone was extremely hospitable, but it was not the hospitality that I needed. And so how I survived and thrived was by mentoring someone like Ogak Ilan, who was in Boston, and later also Rita Nakashima-Bra, who came to Boston to direct Harvard Radcliffe program. So I was a product of those seniors mentoring, investing their time and interest in me so that I could grow. And so having that experience, and then came to PSR GTU, and watching what Cheryl was going through was another wake-up call for me. And at that time, the faculty of color group of the GTU, I think Cheryl and I were the only two women, and the rest of them were men. And we kept wondering if Cheryl were not Black woman, she would have been treated this way and such respect that she deserves not getting, and not even emotional support from the administration, all that. So we had a lot of those conversations. So watching the centers close and Cheryl's work not being respected that deserves, I quickly learned that I need to pay attention to not only to my own well-being, but the well-being of students of color. So, so I was extremely intentional in terms of being part of the faculty of color the support group that met regularly over meal, and then also having intentional time with someone like someone like Rosemary, who invested her time in me and taking me out to lunch and all kinds of things, and having me over to her small apartment and cooking Mediterranean food, that usually tabbouleh salad and lentil soup that she would cook in her apartment. But I didn't like the way she washed her dishes. So and also Judith Berling, who really invested her time in me, and I cannot, count even how many times she had me over at her house for meals and all their conversations, and asking for any needs that I would have. So having these mentors and then forming peer mentoring group because I was a much younger generation than these seniors. And interesting story that when I started going to GTU women faculty gathering once a semester, my first and second and third year, same person asked me each semester whether I am a new person, and I had to reintroduce myself. And these are very senior white feminist scholars who was not up to date with faculty of color, women of color scholarship work. So having the peer mentoring group, mutual peer mentoring group was intentional. And also I started offering students of doctoral students, women of color doctoral students group gathering once a semester, because their experience what they need to do to be successful in the program was different. So I convened that group and how to survive your white male advisor who doesn't understand what you need to do, and all those very needed confidential conversations that I convened monthly. So in 2007, I became the first woman of color to be tenured at the GTU. There were many women of color before me, but they didn't stay before they got tenure, or amazing colleagues like Cheryl was not on tenure track and not being part of a member school. And so those are structural issues that we had. So when I was at the GTU, I was extremely intentional in terms of peer mentoring and mentoring students of color, especially women students of color. And I think that led me my trajectory, because I now in part of multiple national, international mentoring program that I do with someone like Ogak Ilan for students of Asian heritage, and I serve as president of a Pan-Autumn. And mentoring is our most important component of our Pan-Autumn, the Asian Feminist Theology Group. And also, I do another mentoring group at ILIF too, particularly convening global majority students and faculty group once a semester in my house for meals, and also students, PhD students, and all of those. So I think even though it was not through positive experience, but watching what's happening to people of color at a white institution, liberal institution, I had to do something that proactively to sustain people and their livelihood and then to support myself and to ourselves.
Thank you so much. And yes, I think themes of intersectionality and peer support and working against the real systems of oppression that we do encounter in the world and in our institutions are so important. So thank you each for sharing these important stories and names and areas of work. Seeing our time, I think we're going to move forward now. And just, on the occasion of our 55th anniversary here, would love to hear from each of you just what you think in terms of the legacy of women's studies and religion, how GTU has been a leader in this area. Maybe you can compare to other institutions, or just speaking generally about some of the key achievements and successes and parts of the history that you want to make sure are lifted up and remembered on this occasion. So yeah, Dr. Pamela, what would you share around that?
Well, I actually want to read something briefly from that 2007 essay, but I also want to mention Margaret McMahon, who was one of the 3 co-directors. I was the first sole director, and there had been controversy about that too. Before that, it was more of a collective, and there was some concern about what did that mean in terms of hierarchy and authority. And fortunately, Margaret stayed on and was part of staff, and we tried to have as collaborative a staff relationship as possible. But we kept moving, kind of creeping in the direction of more standard organizational structures, partly because our funding was kind of demanding it. So I want to read this from 2007. And this was also based on my experience at that conference. I said, whatever forms feminism, plural, is taking and will take at the GTU from today forward, so this is 2007, CWR has left a lasting legacy of profound and challenging thought and advocacy for future generation. Not only seeds, to quote Mary Hunt, but also flowers that bloomed in their own season. It is my hope that in moving forward, a wide array of radical, pragmatic, woman-affirming, and increasingly diverse women's spiritual, religious, ethical, and theological thought, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, will be given a forum for both reflection and action, with particular attention to the increasing racial, ethnic, sexual, cultural, and religious diversity of women's voices. And intersectionality wasn't even a word we knew at the GTU, or at least nobody was talking about it very much. But we were intuiting our way toward knowing that we needed a great deal more diversity. My primary concern after attending the day-long symposium celebrating CWR's history and envisioning a future for women's studies at the GTU is that as feminist theologians and feminists deeply concerned with religion, we are still mostly talking, refining, redefining, arguing, and nuancing differences among ourselves. The median age of the audience at this conference seemed much older than at typical CWR events in the early 1990s. While a women's studies concentration would be a strong addition to the GTU's options for committed feminist scholars, it is my conviction that more is needed. My vision is that every seminary require every student, both male and female, and dare I say every faculty member, to study and become conversant with the now 3 decades of profound contributions made by feminist, womanist, mujerista, Asian, and global women theologians. So I want to end my response to this question with a question. How is it now? Where have we gone since 2007 in terms of both the resilience of women's studies at some level at the GTU, but also the continuing struggle for it to even survive, much less to thrive, and to be regarded as a priority by the whole GTU institution? Where are we now?
Good question. Good question. Yeah, certainly the struggle has continued. Dr. Sheryl, please.
Thank you. One of the things I've come to recognize, and I've got more radical in speaking about it, is the huge imprint of white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalistic misogyny. It is very much alive, and with the MAGA people and the Maha people, even stronger, because people have tied their faith and their patriotism into one web, and because people have drank the Kool-Aid a lot of logic has left the building. So I'm very much aware of that spider web. I also remember that if we look at the Constitution, when it says all men are created equal, it meant specifically all white male Protestant landowners. So in part and parcel, Project 2025 is moving us back to where the original Constitution was. And I think it really speaks to the importance of us knowing history. Third, I think one thing that I've lived through, but I'm not sure I've ever seen it expressly addressed at CWR or other places, because of the diversity of age ranges and gender and non-binary, the whole gamut of who we are as women, as feminists, etc., sometimes more senior scholars in different places want to be the only, and therefore, because they want to be the only, they're not as welcoming and as supportive of younger, I'm going to call them women's liberation scholars. I've seen that myself. In fact, one of my experiences at the GTU, I will not call names, but literally my legs got cut up from under me from a senior white female scholar. And I'm going, what? So not sure that comes out of fear.
Maybe that person is the one who kept asking me to reintroduce myself. I think we are just talking about the same person.
It's quite possible. So I think at some point we have to look at those issues. We also have to look at how, and this was to Dr. Mary's point earlier, how different places in quote unquote class, although in the United States we don't like to talk about it, but what are the differences? And also we look at multiple cultures. How do Native women express themselves versus women from Alaska versus women from, say, Southern United States versus Northeast? We all come with different expectations. And I think one of the things that will be important going forward is to help us learn how to do active listening, to register our own personal biases so that we can really be present, be willing to grow, and be willing to embrace each other. And for me, until every syllabus and every course requires that students have cultural competencies, and that every syllabus has required readings from textbooks and articles by a variety of people expressing their theological, their spiritual beliefs, then we've got a ton of more work to do.
Amen. Yes, yes. That internal work personally and in our courses, it all connects. So thank you for
and in the systems, because and the last thing, we always have to remember, as hard as we work, systems are designed to protect themselves. Systems don't want to change. And that's so a lot of time we're like Sisyphus, we're going up the hill carrying a bunch of stuff. And we need to learn how to do self-care amidst that, but also how can we befriend those with the power so that we don't have to compromise ourselves, but we're able to move the project forward.
Yeah, being strategic and power analysis. Yes, amen to that as well. Dr. Nancy,
Yeah.
please.
I mean, I certainly echo and support what has already been said. And I would certainly, too, I was thinking about Rosemary Radford Ruther, who was very, very important during my time at the GTU. She was on my dissertation committee, and Margaret Miles, and even figures like Judith Burling. And so you ask about legacy, and I think that that legacy lives inside of me. It really shaped my experience. And I'm wondering where's the investment today so that the individuals today who are shaping the world in terms of women and women's experience and a critique of misogyny, how they might continue to have the support and the strength in order to do that. And I think it's of vital importance today that the legacy lives on because, for example, I'm on a dissertation committee from Boston College of a woman who's looking at the sexual abuse of women in Santiago, Chile. And I was thinking, without there being support, that kind of project doesn't happen. So how do those projects, how does the attention to violence against women in many, many forms, how does that continue to be at the forefront of what we're doing? And without it, we really undermine a support for the value of women. I'm thinking about questions here in our own country of sex trafficking as well, which is another area that we need a lot more work in, and where we have the support for women who have an interest in exploring and examining this. And in terms of my own kind of history, places where the legacy that has been before, like Rosario Castellanos and Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, where is it that we can learn from these women in places like the GTU if we don't have the Women's Center, Women's Studies and Religion, if that isn't supported amply? So that the legacy question, I think, is in and around those different points. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so important. Dr. Mary, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about women who've graduated from the GTU. I'm thinking, for example, of Jennifer Reisinger, who's been teaching at San Jose, just wrote a wonderful book on Black women's educational programs. Victoria Rue, whom some of you know, whose plays on her enormously creative drama, use of drama for interreligious dialogue and discourse, her Miriam and Mary materials with Palestinian women, her work on women's abortion stories. And Julia Watts-Belser, Loving Our Own Bones, which just won the major prize in religion. Julia Watts-Belser's work, I think, is just, those are just three of my sister graduates of the GTU. And I think of GTU people like them as, and particularly the women, as creative, multidimensional in study and practice, untamed, unfettered by convention, never caught up in the academic grind for its own sake, but study for the sake of changing the world. That's how I see the women, at least the ones that I have known well. Some here present. I'm looking at you, Nancy. This has been, for me, the most important thing. And I think when we look at the value of the GTU, it not only has its location in terms of being at the edge of the Pacific Rim, it is a multi-faith and secular organization set up through UCB as well as the schools. And the value on interdisciplinary work has always made the GTU a place that can be, I believe, so much more than it is. Now, when Rosemary Ruther was there, the GTU had some higher profile, shall we say. I think we need some anchoring people like that in the doctoral program at the GTU. Otherwise, these very few doctoral students, I think, are going to go in very different directions. I worry about that. I also think that the most exciting work in theology at large is being done in womanist, mujerista, and feminist fields at the intersection of queer work, liberationist, post-colonial, and disability studies, to wit, Julia's book. And I think this is the fact that we've been doing this work in pieces at the GTU, but never really woven together, perhaps, in a way that makes a coherent program that is really fundable, is a problem. And it's a problem that we have been a part of solving, I think, for a long time. I think as the theological education pool shrinks across the country, as some of the big name schools, as it were, get more of the resources, it's important for the GTU to distinguish itself to be what it does best. Distinguish itself by doing what it does best, which is to produce the kinds of students and scholars of creativity, of intellectual and moral daring, and a keen focus on how our work can be useful. And that, I think, is a kind of challenge that we look ahead to. And every single person that I've named in this litany, as it were, I've tried to have my own kind of litany of the saints here. In this kind of litany, every person that I've named has been, and all here present, have been among the people who are doing work in that kind of way. And I think that's the profile the GTU wants. And the white maleness of the GTU is still very much a part of the scene. There are exceptions. I think, Cheryl, you made an important point that the centers, even back in the day, the centers were the tail that wagged the dog. I mean, the GTU was the tail that wagged the dog. It was the centers that were really leading the way. And it was the centers where exciting work was being done. And it continues to be. The LGBTQ work, any work done on queer and disability work is certainly not being done as in a mainstream way as it should be, especially in Berkeley. And certainly the Center for the Studies of Muslim and other non-Christian religions is terribly important in the GTU. And I think these are the things that make it unique, and that, in fact, if those were lifted up and not apologized for or defunded, but in fact lifted, made central, foregrounded, there would be a new trajectory for the GTU.
Thank you so much. Yes. Yes. Dr. Boyung, in our last couple minutes, please.
I cannot agree with what Mary said more. I think, when we are designing the syllabus for women's study and religion between Jewish women, Christian women, also women from Europe, women from Asia, women from this country, we struggled a lot because we had a very different understanding. But we arrived at a place that everybody was agreeable that we need to design women's studies and religion basic program syllabus in an interreligious, transnational, not focusing on North American centric way or Christocentric way. So I think GTU is a really distinctive school that could do that with all the centers and then the diversity of student bodies. And I think GTU was the only place that I used to teach Asian feminist theology. And I used to say that probably this is the only place that I could teach the class, and the class is not only making, but it is also flourishing, right? So I hope that GTU continue to do that, even, as Mary said earlier, it's, or I guess it's Pam, it's people who come together to make it happen. And we initiate and we challenge the administration and we initiated and then we fought. That's how we came, we kept moving forward, although that's not ideal situation. So I hope that women's studies and religion does not lose the teeth for interreligious approach to women's studies religion, not North American centric and not Christocentric, not middle class centric, but what GTU embodies are continued.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for these beautiful memories and also wishes and dreams and visions for the future.